You're listening to Shoe In, covering the ins and outs of all things footwear, from sneakers to heels, loafers to slippers, and every type of shoe in between. Brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear.
You know, Thomas Crockett, we bring in, 2.5, 2.7 billion pairs of shoes every year. You know, I mean, who's counting? But we do. We have it in the data. We put it out actually monthly so people can track it in the Intel Center at fdra.org. Every time I say that number to people who don't know footwear, they're blown away constantly. And then you say, okay, well, about 3/4 of that comes through basically two ports of entry, which are side by side and so critical to our industry and to our consumers. And then you really get people's attention. And you say, it's down in sunny Southern California, which what's not to like about being down in Long Beach and then in LA. And so people then really want to talk about it. And so that's why I think today's guest is going to be in high demand because of the amount of product that flows through his port, the amount of focus the ports and the supply chain have had. The spotlight's been super hot on the supply chain and the ports over the last 2 or 3 years. And so I think we're collectively counting our breath. And this will give us an opportunity to see where things stand as it relates to the ports. And so, Thomas, with that, why don't you introduce our good friend who's on Shoe and Show today?
Yeah, so we're bringing in our good friend Cesar Sanchez with the Port of Long Beach to talk about port issues, transportation issues, everything we're seeing around there. So, Cesar, thanks so much for joining us today. We're very excited to have you on.
Thank you, Matt and Thomas. Appreciate the invitation.
Wondering, too, let's just get started with your perspective on kind of where are things right now with the port. I know we had the past couple of years, we had some very crazy and unprecedented supply chain issues, but where do things stand today with how goods are moving through the port?
Well, I must say we are in a much different place today than, say January of last year. January of last year, we had approximately 109 vessels that were queued up, and a very difficult time for the supply chain. We all experienced it. And I do have to say that, beginning November of last year, there was a complete clear up and cleanup of vessels, whereas today we have no ships waiting or queuing up, and everything is definitely going alongside and getting worked right away. So much different landscape today than what we had seen in the past. But, just to touch a little bit on what we had experienced in the last 3 years, all-time record numbers in volumes, right? 2020 through 2022, I think is definitely unprecedented in regards to the volumes peaking all the way to 9.4 million TEUs on an annual basis, which was an all-time high experience in 2021. So we've come a long way. There's been a lot of lessons learned. The terminals today are in much better shape. There's been a lot of lessons learned. As of today, I believe we have 7 vessels that are at berth, 19 en route, which would be 150 nautical miles out, coming in from Asia markets. But with that said, 19 compared to what we had seen in the past, on average, on a weekly basis, we'd probably see closer to 28 vessels. So that just comes to show that there's less vessels coming in. Obviously, there's been voids and blank sailings that have been taking place, and we're seeing that today in the volumes. As of our March numbers, we hit just north of 603,000 TEUs for the month of March. And that number is actually 30% down from last year. So major change. But again, the last 3 years were record numbers and something that we had not experienced in the past. Should also comment that 603,000 number, and really for the first quarter of 2023, it's already proving to be a much better quarter than 2019. So we're definitely tracking better than pre-pandemic, which is good. But we do have some rough seas ahead, I think, still.
You mentioned lessons learned too. I'm wondering, what are some takeaways from pandemic, supply chain crisis, some things that you did learn, made some changes to try to prevent issues in the future?
Well, I think some of the lessons learned, the supply chain, very fragile, right? Requires all parties to be a participant in the supply chain. And I say this in regards to what we experienced with congestion at the terminals, which was really the start of the perfect storm. First, it was the terminals, then it was the chassis, the truckers, the warehouses, the oversupply of inventory, labor issues. There was so many things that happened, but it really showed that as the supply chain, it is everyone's, I think, work or involvement that is needed to ensure that the supply chain remains strong and smooth. And again, there was so many bottlenecks in the process that moving forward, we feel that as long as everyone's working in tandem, the communication's there, that the terminals are, of course, listening to the voice of the customer, that when carriers contract out with customers, that there's certain stipulations in the contracts that obviously minimize the amount of time that containers sit in the terminals. I think that was one of the major variables with be it extended free time, that there was a bunch of cargo sitting at the terminals. And a lot of these terminals, really, they're not built for storage. We saw that here in the local terminals here and really nationwide. But then I think it was magnified more so when we started to see that containers were starting to stack up at rail yards, where then that created the domino effect of cargo basically coming to a halt.
You know what? I'm of the two minds when it comes to this question about lessons learned, because you were talking about the astronomical numbers, record numbers of containers that came through the port over the last few years. And footwear is a microcosm of that, Cesar. So our record year retail in 2019 was $87 billion, I think $87.3 billion. In 2021, we hit our new record from 19, $100 billion. So we went from 87 to $100 billion in a year and a half, essentially. And then last year, $105 billion. So when you dump $2 trillion into an economy in a response to a global pandemic that, fingers crossed, Lord willing, is a once in 100-year kind of thing, that's going to jam up our infrastructure. And it's kind of like when my brother and I used to play in the yard, and I was go take a sip of water out of the hose, and he would crank it and then unleash it and it would spray me in the face. Essentially, like the ports and the supply chain were getting sprayed in the face by the volume coming in. And so the question comes down to it, we learn lessons, but what do we do with something that seems so out of the norm for normal operating procedure? Do we do a bunch of new things and make a lot of new investments that are supposed to take that kind of capacity on at any given moment? I don't know how to critically think about the best way to implement practical lessons while not going above and beyond to accommodate for every once in 100-year catastrophe that impacts the supply chain.
Matt, great point. And one of the major responsibilities here at the Port of Long Beach, and be it Port Authority, is really thinking about strategic projects that will allow us to grow. And again, part of the lesson learned is, how can we be more efficient? How can we push more freight through the Port of Long Beach and or the San Pedro Bay Gateway? One of the things that we're doing from an investment point of view is we're investing $2.2 billion in infrastructure, and that's here in the next 10 years, and that'll be a combination of adding rail capacity. We have the Rail B plan project on its way. It is a 9-10 year project, but it will be in a phased in approach. It will allow, and ideally, our goal is to be able to push as much as 30% of all imports coming in onto the on dock rail, and really increase the total amount of volume that can be processed here through the Port of Long Beach. As you know, there's very little land left. You have to utilize the land as efficient as possible. So we feel that'll be the next step to allow us to increase the total capacity. Again, with the help and support of customers and carriers, the terminal operators, to be able to efficiently move that product through the rail lines into the IPI locations.
We saw that firsthand when we've done our FTDC event. We would often do tours of the port, and just seeing the technology and the advancements and the port improvements that really make it unique and strengthen the ports of Long Beach and LA was really neat to see firsthand. And so you're hoping we can do that again soon. But you did mention earlier kind of potential rough seas on the horizon or things on the horizon. Is there anything you're thinking about right now, or things that we should be thinking about that may be coming up in the near future or even longer?
Well, for us, it's really how do we move forward, and how do we bring some of those volumes back? No secret, West Coast has lost some of the volumes to various reasons. But we can really look back and say, when did the drop in volumes really start happening, right? So a lot of folks will say, well, it's been over the last, really the last, year or so, as folks were looking to mitigate some of the possible, negotiations and, possible disruptions, which frankly speaking, we haven't seen much happen. And I think that's progressing well. But, with that said, back in, I would say back in 2019, we already started seeing a shift to other gateways, right? And even prior to that, when you have the Suez, you have the East Coast, you have the capacity for larger vessels to start operating on the East Coast, not to mention the Panama Canal. That allowed for some of the carriers to start looking at East Coast services and making those services a bit more viable for customers by increasing their capacity. So we started to already see some of those volumes shift out. Now, the pandemic, of course, created some great opportunities for other gateways that perhaps at one point might not have been as viable. There's been a lot of money and infrastructure build out that has allowed some of these authorities and ports to operate in a much larger scale, which makes them a very feasible option nowadays. So we're seeing that. We're seeing that happen, not to mention some of the shifts that we've also seen, from, say, China to Southeast Asia, India subcontinent, that also allows itself to route through the Suez to the East Coast, making the East Coast a viable option, more so today than it was, 15 years ago. The Gulf also, one of those gateways that has built out quite a bit on the infrastructure, and not to mention that some of the larger retailers have set up shop in those areas that would make that a natural gateway for them. So I think we've gone from, at one time being, West Coast, 50% of all freight coming in from Asia, down to, I think, 42 or 43%. So there's definitely been a change in total volume and how much of that volume is actually coming through the San Pedro Bay Gateway.
Let me ask you this. As of the recording of this conversation, Cesar, the labor negotiations continue. We're all reading tea leaves and press releases and posture and in certain, temporary or very finite slowdown kind of things that are happening. Where do we sit kind of relative to the negotiations, and what is your view from an optimism perspective? Just to remind our listeners that about this time during the last negotiations, things started to really hit the fan in the spring of 15. And everyone and their grandmother knew what the supply chain was and what the port was at that moment. It seems a little less kind of heated right now, which is good. Like, goodness gracious, thank you. So kind of what's your view based on what happened in 15, where we are now, and what you expect to happen in the future?
Well, we've been down this path before, and this is really nothing new to, negotiations, be it between the PMA and the ILWU. We did see some great things happen during, the pandemic, where ILWU was amazing. They showed up to work. They did everything they could to keep the supply chain moving. They were very supportive of what needed to happen, and it was a very difficult time. But nonetheless, they came through. I would say for the U.S. economy as a whole, for everyone that was looking to, purchase their goods, be it furniture at one time, exercise equipment, all those things that we are now, I think, building up on inventory because we've shifted our appetite a bit. But we've gone through a few different stages, and there's been a few things that have happened both on the PMA and ILWU side. I would have to say, this is just part of the process. I think we're hearing a lot of great news and media now where the two sides are coming together. They are negotiating. They have been working in good faith. And I feel that this is something that will come to a final agreement here, probably so in the next few weeks, given all the great press and the news around, both parties coming to mutual agreements on some of the major items.
Matt mentioned the 2015 issue, and it seems very different from what we're seeing now. And to Matt's point, we were hearing from companies all over the country who were impacted. And then you look at the rail situation, which was fairly recent, and that seemed to just come up overnight for a lot of people, where it's this breakdown and potential crisis, and the Biden administration gets involved, and then it's averted, and all this this situation. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, what makes this a little different from what happened with rail and what happened in 2015?
Well, I think what makes this different is I think a lot of us, and be it even our own family members, now I think believe or understand a bit better on what is it that we do in the supply chain, and how we are all a very integral part of making sure that the goods movement is happening, right? We here in the logistics arena received a lot of media attention during the pandemic. First time ever, I think, just around the dinner table, there was discussions around logistics and supply chain, and everyone seemed to now know what supply chain's all about, and I think have a better understanding of what we do in the supply chain. So that was definitely a shift. But with that said, there was involvement at the federal level as well, and engagement, and even to this date, there's still engagement, and there's still a lot of visibility to what's going on. Obviously, it's still very delicate, and I think versus 2015, I think everyone has a better understanding, wants to see this come to a conclusion, and a positive one where it'll be a mutual win-win situation for all parties. But again, I think this time around, because of the high visibility, there could be additional help or support to make sure that these two parties can come together and find that solution.
Yeah, that's well said, Cesar. And I want to applaud you for being responsive and available as the main representative of the Port of Long Beach. One of the things that I know you pride yourselves in and have displayed continuously is accessibility and engagement with the shipping community and with the brands that are members of ours. You're consistently on our weekly call every 2:00 Tuesday East Coast time, and you're giving your kind of input as to what's happening on the ground. And I know you do a lot of behind the scenes work that we're not even aware of when someone has a container held up somewhere. Doing the due diligence and digging and trying to dislodge that has been something that you do. And so I want to publicly thank you for being the go-between, because it's not an easy job in the sense that you guys own the land. You operate the port broadly. You're public servants in that regard, but you also are not the terminal operators. And so you're kind of caught in the middle. But you do so with class and with accessibility. And so I want to thank you for doing that on behalf of all of our members.
Well, thank you, Matt. I appreciate that. And trust that here at the Port of Long Beach, we are and want to be the port of choice. And with that said, myself and my team here is here to help support, guide, provide assistance wherever possible, really connect the dots, and ensuring that, cargo flow is there. And if there's any pain points, that we help facilitate that. And with that said, we have a great rapport with the carriers calling the Port of Long Beach. We have great rapport with the terminal operators. So again, we're here as a resource, free of charge. And ultimately our goal is to bring the freight back, to regain that trust from our customers, that when things do get difficult, that we will be here to help support them. So I appreciate you saying that too, Matt, because that is what we do, and that's what I live for here. And this is why I actually shifted from working on the carrier side over to the Port Authority, because I wanted to do the most good. So this is, I feel, a good place for me.
That's awesome. I think it's a great place for you, Cesar. And to our listeners, it's a great place for you to consistently be focused on the supply chain. Don't let your interests ebb, because the supply chain is always flowing. And it's important that even in downtimes, you understand what's happening at the ports, how footwear is moving throughout the world, and what some of the pain points might be. Because as we can all attest, these last few years have exposed every single pain point possible. And I'll be very interested to see, with the investments and the initiatives that Cesar has outlined, what the port looks like a decade from now, particularly with those federal funds coming in that were recently appropriated. So, Cesar, thank you again for joining us today and providing some insights, and we really appreciate it. To our Shoe and Show listeners, make sure you drop in and listen to all of our episodes. We are the business side of footwear. We're focused on the entire supply chain, and this is just another critical point, the port of entry, and learning more about how footwear moves and how you can be more informed and engaged on this issue and many other issues. Go to shoeandshow.com. There's a whole catalog of episodes, closing in on almost 400 episodes to choose from. Many of them are still relevant today. We encourage you to go back and check those out. Rate us where you can. We only accept 5 stars, so there's an algorithm we've developed. It's unique, and if you go and hit 4.75 stars or 4.5 stars, it will automatically be kicked out, because we know this is a 5-star podcast. But of course, we're biased. But with that, until next time, Shoe and Show is out.
Shoe In has been brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear. For information about FDRA, visit fdra.org.